Good morning. I'm going to continue with my series on the World Championships of the past, and we're in 2012, the World Championship between Vishwanath Anand here, who was white, the defending champion, and the challenger Veselin Topalov. Uh, yeah, it was a 12-game match, and there was only two games won. Anand won the last of them in game 8 to level the match, and then they drew the next four. And so they went into a rapid play tiebreak, where Anand was considered a big favourite. He'd been known as the best rapid player in the world for a long time. Won the World Rapid Play Championship several times. Really was a big part of making rapid play a more serious thing. That the reigning world champion, Vishy Anand, put so much time and effort into rapid play, made it yeah, more more commonly seen at the highest levels. So yeah, he was expected to win this rapid play match, fairly rapid play portion of the match fairly easily. The first two games were a draw, and indeed the last game was a draw. But this, the third out of four rapid games, is the decisive game, and remarkably enough, is the longest game in the match. So let's have a look at it. Vishy plays e4, c5, the Sicilian, knight f3, and knight c6. In the Sicilian, the two players fight for their own advantages. They don't work against each other's advantages as you do in the so-called open games where e4 and e5 are played and both are fighting over directly over the same square in the centre. Here, white is fighting to control the d4 and e5 squares, and black is controlling already the d4 square and is fighting for the e5 square. The d5 square is controlled by white, so it's a different, good way of developing, and yeah, very common in master play these days. This is called the Nezmetdinov-Rosalimo attack. Nezmetdinov is one of my favourite players ever, a fantastic attacker, a fantastic sacrificial player, probably the strongest player ever not to have become a GM. He didn't ever get the honorary, he got the IM title, but never the honorary GM title. I see that FIDE have decided to start dishing out posthumous GM titles to folks, so just keep my fingers crossed that Nezmetdinov's turn comes soon enough. Anyway, e6, one of the common responses is to play e6 and let this knight be taken, and take back with the b or the c pawn and have a strange pawn structure, but that pawn structure, whichever way you take it back, gives you a really good grip on the d5 square and the centre altogether. So he takes the knight, giving up the two bishops and damaging the pawn structure. But these pawns are really strong for black and have a really strong grip on the centre. And if the knights get out, the bishops get out into the open, they can be very effective here. So, yeah. Pawn comes to b3 and the pawn comes to e5. Yeah, probably it's a little bit in the way for this bishop there. But anyway, knight comes to c6. So is this a pawn sacrifice? No, it isn't, because the queen comes to e7. Knight comes to d4. Pawn comes to d6. Pawn comes to d4 to defend the knight, and pawn comes to d6. The knight takes another pawn. So no, it is a pawn sacrifice. Now Vishy has two pawns up, but he gets a check for it and a pawn, so he's one pawn down. Takes with the king. bishop comes to b7, threatening the knight and threatening the pawn on b2 behind it. Knight goes to a5, and the pawn does indeed come to b2 at g2. The rook attacks the bishop, which moves to h3, and now you can see it's 7 pawns against 6, but he has the chance to take this pawn, and he does take that pawn. So it's now 6 pawns against 5 pawns against 5. So they're sorry, it was 6 against 6. Now it's 5 against 5. So they're completely even in pawns. But both kings are completely open to the elements. So the knight develops. Is it brave or foolish to castle king side, queen side? I don't know. But d6 maybe at some point in time, followed by one of the roots to d1. Looks good. So the bishop comes. It gets swapped off, and now you might think Vishy would take this pawn, but no. He attacks rather this pawn. Knight comes to f6, and he takes the pawn, and now he's got 3 pawns against 1 on the queen side, and 2 against 3 on the queen side. So he's got a pawn extra, but 2 against 3 is difficult for a pass pawn to be created by black here. White already has a pass pawn. The king comes to b8, and the knight attacks the rook. The other rook says check, and the knight comes to e3 to block it. So knight comes to g4. He might be threatening at some point in time to overwhelm the knight on e4 and e3, and thereby win a pawn. So the knights double up, and he takes one of the knights, and it's taken. The bishop plays to g4 with a check, and the pawn comes to f3. So now the knight is exposed to the rooks being doubled, but the bishop has to come out of the way. And yeah, the rooks can be doubled, but as soon as they're doubled, the king will step out of the way. So rook comes to h6 to try and win this pawn. So the rook comes to e1 to defend, and the rook comes back to e6. So he defends with the rook on c3. Good idea. Pawn comes to f5. Now he threatens to play f4, pin the knight, win the knight. So the king comes out of the way, and the knight is chased anyway. Knight comes to d5, d4 even, no, d5, and yeah, attacks the pawn. Pawn comes to g5 to support it. He must have thought it was better than playing rook here, check. The rook comes to d3. This gives the king this escape square, crucially, a dark colored escape square. And the rook comes to e2 with check. King comes to c1 so that there isn't further checks. Rook comes to f2 so that he's threatening the c pawn, but more crucially, threatening to double up on the second rank. Pawn comes to h4, and he does indeed double on the second rank. And the rook comes to c3, where it can't be harassed and is on a dark square, free from attack from the bishop. Bishop comes to b7 to attack the knight, and the rook defends the bishop. Pawn takes the knight, so now it's 3 against 1 for each on opposite sides. But these pawns are a lot less well coordinated than these 3, of course. And the knight takes the pawn, and it's a pawn advantage to Vishy again. The rook goes to e8, and the rook comes to h1 to threaten the pawn again. Rook comes to c8, and the rooks are swapped off, and the pawn is taken on h4. The bishop comes to f5. Instead of just taking this pawn, he defends this pawn, his passed pawn, and attacks the white structure. Smart. The bishop is attacked, and he takes the pawn, still defending his pawn, and the structure is weaker. But yeah, Still a pawn up to Vichy. Rook's check, and king comes to a8. He's in the corner. d5 is remarkably a checkmate threat this late in the game. Knight to c7 would be mate. So the pawn moves to give the king an escape square, and the rook attacks the pawn. King comes to b7, and the knight attacks the pawn. And it's really difficult now for Vichy Topalov to defend the pawn. So he abandons it and gets this pawn instead. So it's still 2 against 1. And a complicated but drawish game at the minute. The knight comes to c5 with a check. King comes to b6. Lovely king fork, but the pawn defends both. The rook attacks the pawn, and now a nice little setup for Vichy, because everything is on a dark square, invisible to the light squared bishop. Rook comes to g4, and the king, sticking on dark, comes forward. Pawn comes to h5, and Vichy says check. He's heading for d5 square, where he can attack both the knight and the bishop, and he's also attacking this pawn. King comes to b7, and he attacks the knight and the bishop. King comes to g2 check, and the king comes to c3, again sticking to dark squares. But the check has allowed the 2 pieces to escape from the knight fork. Knight comes to d3, and the pawn comes to h4. Obviously, he's covering the square from which the rook can get behind the pawn. But we'll see. He threatens the rook, the bishop, which comes to g6, and knight comes to f4, threatening both. Again, he uses a check to get out of this, and this time the check also is a skewer on the pawn behind on a3. But he's willing to abandon that, because if he does win the pawn, he loses the bishop. So the bishop comes to c2, and Vichy proposes trade of prisoners again. And they agree. And now Vichy's the only one left with the pawn, and it's pass pawn. But the game is, according to analysis, completely drawn. But Topalov has to find all the right moves in the time he has left. And yeah, the rook comes to g5. Draws a line. You're not getting past here, because I'll take it. The pawn comes forward. The bishop comes to f5. Looking maybe to come to c8 and b7 to definitely stop the pawn. Rook cuts the bishop off. Bishop comes to g4. He was threatening to come to f3 and threaten the knight. Yeah, he proposes a rook trade. If the rooks are traded, this is a draw, because the bishop can always guard one of these squares. So he doesn't want a draw. He plays check. Keeps the game alive. Bishop comes to f3, so he's now got a double attack on the knight. King comes to b8, and the knight attacks defends the pawn and gets out of the way of double attack. Bishop comes to b7, in many ways an ideal square for the bishop. The king is heading to b6. He has to go round the back of this pawn, because the rook's cutting him off. And yeah, the knight comes first to cover the d5 square, because the pawn, cover the b7 square, because the pawn doesn't need to at the minute queen, because it can use the pawn as part of a checkmating net. If the pawn's here on b6 and the knight is here, then check will be mate, because the pawn will cut off these 2 squares and the knight will cut off this one. So rook comes to f7 again, a swap of rooks will be a draw. Vishy doesn't want to draw, he attacks the bishop. But now the rook is guarding the 7th rank, it's in an ideal place. So the knight, yeah, does do that business of making, of covering g7, and now Vishy is threatening to play rook, bishop here, king here, and then he's always got a mate threat on the back rank. So the king makes a run for it, and the king is cut off by the rook. It might seem like running away from the pawn like this is a bad idea, but the pawn's covered twice by the bishop and by the rook. Doesn't need the king there, so it's actually a perfectly drawn idea. King comes to a5, so that, you know, if the king comes back, he's got that mating threat. And if we look at the analysis, very slight advantage to white, but black's next move is a disaster. Rf5. Why is this a disaster? Because it does two things. It gives up the 7th rank and it allows the king access to the 6th rank. But he says check, and the king goes back that way, and now the knight attacks the bishop and the rook, and now we're suddenly going to be in an endgame, rook endgame with an extra pawn which is on the 6th rank and well supported by the king. So it's swapped off, and the king comes, and I think, you know, he didn't quite give up there. The rook plays check, king comes to d7, and the rook comes behind in front of the pawn, so that so that he will be getting a new queen soon. This is a well-known technique. I suggest that if you don't know how to win this, then set it up and play against the computer until you get the pawn through. But Gelfand knows that Vishy is going to win this. He's going to get that pawn through. I said that it was Topalov in this game. Of course, this is the World Championship against Boris Gelfand, not Veselin Topalov. This is what happens when been on night shift last night. I'm going to be on night shift again tonight, and yeah, not at my best. More mistakes than usual, but let me assure you, this is the World Championship match between Vishy Anand with white and Boris Gelfand with black. Gelfand realises that Anand is going to manage to queen that pawn and resigns. And yeah, then Vishy retains his World Championship match. His World Championship with this win against Boris Gelfand. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Subscribe and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.